I just want to check my balance, the girl in torn clothes whispered. The bank director burst out laughing, but when the screen lit up, his smile vanished forever, and the truth that emerged would destroy everything he believed about power and wealth. The Grand Metropolitan Bank stood like a monument to wealth and exclusivity in the heart of the financial district. Its marble columns rose toward cathedral ceilings, and crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across floors so polished they reflected the faces of those deemed worthy enough to walk upon them. Digital screens displayed stock prices and currency exchanges in real time, their blue glow adding to the atmosphere of cold, calculated power. Security guards in impeccable uniforms stood at every corner, their eyes trained to identify anyone who didn't belong. On this particular morning, Victor Ashford sat in his corner office on the mezzanine level, overlooking the main banking floor like a king surveying his kingdom. At 53 years old, Victor had spent 3 decades building his reputation as the most ruthless bank director in the city. His personal fortune exceeded $200 million, accumulated through investments, inheritance, and what he privately called strategic ruthlessness. He wore a watch that cost more than most people earned in a year, and he made sure everyone knew it. Victor was reviewing quarterly reports when his personal assistant, Marcus, knocked softly on the glass door. "Sir, there's a situation on the main floor you might want to see." Victor didn't look up. "Handle it." "Sir, I really think you should see this yourself." Something in Marcus's voice made Victor finally raise his eyes. In 15 years, Marcus had never insisted on anything. Victor stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks, and walked to the glass railing that overlooked the banking floor below. What he saw made him laugh out loud. Standing at the main reception counter was a girl who looked no older than 12 or 13. Her clothes were worn and tattered, with holes that spoke of months or perhaps years of use without replacement. Her hair was tangled and unwashed, falling in messy strands around a face smudged with what appeared to be dirt. She carried no purse, no bag, nothing except a small, crumpled piece of paper clutched tightly in her trembling hand. Around her, the wealthy clients of Grand Metropolitan Bank had created a visible circle of distance, as if poverty might be contagious. Some covered their noses with handkerchiefs. Others whispered to each other with expressions of disgust and amusement. "This is priceless," Victor murmured, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "I have to see this up close." He descended the curved marble staircase slowly, savoring every step, every moment of anticipation. By the time he reached the main floor, a small crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle. Helena Monroe, one of his senior account managers, stood behind the counter with an expression of barely concealed contempt. "I've already told you," Helena was saying, her voice cold and dismissive. "This bank does not serve people without proper identification and account documentation. You need to leave before I call security." The girl didn't move. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper, but there was something in it that made several people lean forward to hear. "I just want to check my balance. Please." Helena's laugh was sharp and performative, designed for the audience that had gathered. "Check your balance? Sweetheart, people who look like you don't have balances. They have debts. Now please, you're disturbing our actual clients." Victor decided this was his moment to shine. He loved these opportunities, these chances to remind everyone of the natural order of things. The wealthy belonged in places like this. The poor belonged elsewhere. Invisible. Forgotten. "Is there a problem here?" Victor announced his presence with the authority of someone who had never been questioned in his own domain. Helena straightened immediately. "Mr. Ashford, sir. This person wandered in off the street claiming she has an account with us. I was just explaining that she needs to leave." Victor positioned himself directly in front of the girl, looking down at her with theatrical disdain. Up close, he could see that despite her disheveled appearance, her eyes were remarkably clear and steady. They were the color of autumn leaves, and they held his gaze without flinching. This irritated him more than he expected. "Young lady," Victor began, his voice dripping with condescension, "do you know where you are? This is Grand Metropolitan Bank. We manage portfolios worth more than you could count if you had 100 years. We don't serve—" He paused, gesturing at her appearance. "Whatever this is." Several people in the crowd chuckled. A man in an expensive suit actually applauded softly. The girl's hand tightened on her crumpled paper. My grandmother told me to come here. She said when the time was right, I should come here and check my balance. She gave me this. She held out the paper. Victor didn't take it, but he glanced at it long enough to see what appeared to be an old account number written in shaky handwriting. Your grandmother, Victor repeated, his smile widening. And where is this grandmother now? Waiting outside in her cardboard box? The laughter from the crowd was louder this time. Someone actually said, "Good one, Mr. Ashford." For the first time, the girl's composure cracked slightly. Her lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry. When she spoke, her voice was somehow even quieter than before, yet it carried clearly across the silent marble hall. My grandmother passed away 3 weeks ago, in the shelter where we lived. She was sick for a long time, but she couldn't afford medicine. Before she died, she made me promise to come here. The laughter died instantly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. Even Helena looked momentarily uncertain. But Victor Ashford hadn't built his fortune by being moved by sob stories. In his experience, poor people always had sob stories. It was their currency, their way of extracting sympathy and resources from those who had worked hard to accumulate wealth. How touching, Victor said, his voice flat. But this isn't a charity. This isn't a shelter. This is a bank. And unless you have valid identification and proof of account ownership, you need to leave. Helena, call security. Wait. The girl's voice was suddenly stronger. My grandmother's name was Margaret Sullivan. She said her account has been here for over 40 years. She said to tell you that Robert would want you to help me. Something flickered in Victor's eyes at the name Robert, but it was gone so quickly that no one noticed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't know any Robert, he said coldly, and we have no account under the name Margaret Sullivan. I would know. I know every significant account in this bank. Then check the insignificant ones, the girl said. The audacity of the response made Victor's face flush with anger. No one spoke to him this way. No one challenged him in his own bank. He was about to signal security when something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the girl stood her ground. Perhaps it was a desire to publicly humiliate her even more thoroughly. Or perhaps it was something deeper. Something connected to the name she had mentioned, a name that echoed uncomfortably in chambers of his memory he preferred to keep locked. Fine, Victor declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. Let's settle this publicly, shall we? Helena, check the name. Let's show this poor child that her grandmother's fantasy account doesn't exist. Then security will escort her out and we can all get back to serious business. Helena nodded and turned to her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she entered the name into the system. The girl stood perfectly still, clutching her paper, her eyes never leaving the screen that Helena was watching. Several seconds passed. Helena frowned. She typed something else. Her frown deepened. Is there a problem? Victor asked impatiently. I'm not sure, Helena said slowly. The system is... I need to enter additional authorization codes. This account has flags I've never seen before. Flags? What kind of flags? Executive-level access only. Mr. Ashford, this account requires your personal authorization code to view. Victor felt a strange chill run down his spine. In 30 years at this bank, he had never encountered an account he couldn't access. Every account, every secret, every hidden fortune, he knew them all. It was his business to know. That's impossible, he said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. There's no account in this bank I can't access. Should I try your code, sir? Victor was acutely aware that everyone was watching. The crowd had grown. Even employees from other departments had drifted over to witness the spectacle. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't show weakness or uncertainty. Move aside, he ordered Helena, stepping behind the counter himself. His fingers entered his personal authorization code, a code known only to him, a code that granted access to every secret the bank held. The screen flickered. A new window opened. An account summary appeared. Victor Ashford had seen large numbers in his career. He had managed portfolios for oil tycoons, tech billionaires, and royal families. He had handled transactions that moved markets and shaped economies. He thought he was immune to shock when it came to money. He was wrong. The number on the screen made him grip the counter to keep from stumbling backward. His face, which had been flushed with arrogant anger moments before, drained of all color until it was as white as the marble floors beneath his feet. That's not possible, he whispered. Helena leaned over to look at the screen. Her gasp was audible throughout the silent hall. Mr. Ashford, is that real? Victor couldn't respond. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His eyes were fixed on the screen, on the number that glowed with quiet, devastating power. The girl took a step forward. Her voice was steady when she spoke. My grandmother said you would react this way. She said the ones who worship money are always the most afraid of it. Victor finally found his voice, though it was barely recognizable, thin, strained, stripped of all authority. Who are you? Who was your grandmother, really? The girl looked at the screen, at the number that represented everything her grandmother had protected for so many years. Then she looked back at Victor Ashford, and for the first time since entering the bank, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. My name is Emma Sullivan, and I think you knew my grandmother better than you're pretending. The question is, are you ready to remember the truth? Because I came here for more than just money, Mr. Ashford. I came here for answers, and according to my grandmother, you have all of them. The silence in Grand Metropolitan Bank was absolute. Every eye was on Victor Ashford, watching as the most powerful man in the building stood frozen before a homeless child who had just turned his entire world upside down. And somewhere, in the deepest corners of Victor's memory, a door that had been sealed for decades was beginning to crack open. The number on the screen continued to glow. 847,419.27. $847 million. And this was only the beginning of the secrets that Emma Sullivan would uncover. The number burned itself into Victor Ashford's vision like a brand. $847 million. It was more than his personal fortune. It was more than most countries' annual budgets. It was impossible. And yet there it was, glowing on the screen with undeniable digital certainty. His mind raced through explanations. A system error, a glitch, fraud. There had to be a rational explanation. Accounts like this didn't simply exist in shadows hidden from him, the director who knew every secret the bank held. Clear the floor, Victor managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Helena stared at him. Sir? I said clear the floor. Victor's composure shattered. Everyone out. This is now a private matter. The security guards moved quickly, ushering confused clients toward the exits. Whispers erupted as people were pushed through the marble doors, everyone craning their necks for one last look at the girl in torn clothes who had brought the mighty Victor Ashford to his knees. Within minutes, the grand banking hall was empty except for Victor, Helena, and Emma. The silence was suffocating. Victor finally turned to face Emma. His eyes had changed. The arrogance was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, something that looked almost like fear. Who sent you? He demanded. Who put you up to this? Is this some kind of elaborate scheme? Corporate espionage? Emma remained calm, her small hands still holding the crumpled paper. No one sent me. My grandmother died 3 weeks ago. On her last day, she gave me this paper and made me promise to come here. She said when I saw the balance, everything would start to make sense. Nothing about this makes sense. Victor slammed his palm on the counter. An account with nearly $1 billion sitting dormant for decades, and I knew nothing about it. That's not possible. I've been director here for 15 years. I know every account, every transaction, every secret. Maybe not every secret, Emma said quietly. Victor's jaw clenched. He turned back to the computer and began pulling up account history. His fingers trembled slightly as he navigated through screens of data that revealed themselves layer by layer. The account had been opened 43 years ago. The original deposit had been modest, just over $50,000, but the investment instructions attached to the account were extraordinary. The funds had been allocated across a diverse portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings that had grown exponentially over 4 decades. What caught Victor's attention most was the authorization signature on the original documents. Robert Ashford, his father's name. Victor felt the blood drain from his face for the second time in 10 minutes. His father had died 20 years ago, taking his secrets to the grave, or so Victor had believed. This can't be right, Victor muttered, more to himself than anyone else. My father never mentioned any account like this. He never mentioned anyone named Margaret Sullivan. Maybe he had reasons to keep it secret, Emma said. My grandmother had reasons too. She never told me about the money. She never told me about any of this. We lived in shelters, Mr. Ashford. We ate at soup kitchens. We wore clothes from donation bins. And the whole time, there was almost $1 billion sitting in this bank. The absurdity of it struck Victor with unexpected force. He had laughed at this girl. He had mocked her poverty, her appearance, her audacity to enter his bank. And all along she had been the heir to a fortune that dwarfed his own. Why? The question escaped him before he could stop it. Why would she live like that when she had access to this? Emma's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. That's what I came here to find out. My grandmother was the kindest person I ever knew. She never complained about being poor. She said money was dangerous, that it destroyed people. She said she was protecting me from something. Protecting you from what? She never said. But before she died, she told me that when I turned 13, I should come here. She said the truth would find me when I was strong enough to handle it. And you just turned 13? Emma nodded slowly. 3 days before she died. She held on just long enough to see my birthday. Then she gave me this paper and made me promise. Despite himself, Victor felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't compassion. Victor Ashford didn't do compassion. But it was something adjacent to it. Curiosity, perhaps. Or the unsettling recognition that his father's ghost had just reached out from beyond the grave to upend his carefully ordered world. Helena, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Mr. Ashford, what should we do? This account, the protocols are clear. If she's the legitimate heir, she has rights to these funds. Victor's business instincts kicked in, temporarily overriding his shock. We do nothing until we verify her identity and her claim. This could still be fraud, an elaborate scheme using forged documents and a coached child. I'm not coached, Emma said firmly, and I'm not lying. My grandmother was Margaret Eleanor Sullivan. She was born in this city. She worked as a seamstress most of her life. And according to what you just read, your father opened this account for her 43 years ago. Why would he do that unless they knew each other? The question hung in the air like smoke. Victor had no answer. At least not one he was willing to share with a child he had met 15 minutes ago. Helena, pull up the full documentation for this account. I want every piece of paper, every authorization, every correspondence, and contact our legal department. Tell them to clear their schedules. Helena nodded and hurried off to comply. Victor turned back to Emma, studying her with new eyes. Beneath the dirt and the tattered clothes, he could see something he had missed before. Her bone structure was delicate, but defined. Her posture, despite everything, carried a quiet dignity. And her eyes, those autumn-colored eyes, held an intelligence that belied her circumstances. Where have you been living since your grandmother died? Victor asked, his voice slightly less harsh than before. The shelter wouldn't let me stay without an adult guardian. I've been on the streets, sometimes church basements if they have room. And you walked here from wherever you were sleeping? I took 2 buses. I've been saving coins for months because I knew this day was coming. Victor felt that strange shift in his chest again. He pushed it down ruthlessly. He hadn't become the most powerful banker in the city by going soft over homeless children. You'll need to stay here while we verify your claim, he said. I'll have someone bring you food and water. This could take hours. I've waited my whole life for answers, Emma replied. A few more hours won't break me. Victor retreated to his office, his mind churning with questions and suspicions. He pulled out his personal phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Samuel Whitfield answered on the 3rd ring. He was the family lawyer, the keeper of secrets, the man who had handled Robert Ashford's estate 2 decades ago. Victor, this is unexpected. Samuel, I need you at the bank, now. Something has come up regarding my father's estate. There was a long pause on the other end. What kind of something? The kind that involves an account worth $847 million that I've never seen before. Opened by my father 43 years ago for a woman named Margaret Sullivan. The silence that followed was answer enough. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I'll be there within the hour. And Victor, don't do anything until I arrive. There are things you need to know. Things your father made me swear never to reveal unless someone came looking. The line went dead. Victor stared at his phone, his certainties crumbling around him like sandcastles before a rising tide. Downstairs, Emma sat alone in the empty banking hall. Helena had brought her a sandwich and a bottle of water, the first real food Emma had eaten in days. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching the light shift through the great windows as morning turned to noon. She thought about her grandmother, about their tiny room at the shelter, barely big enough for 2 beds, about the stories Margaret would tell her at night, stories about a time before the shelters, before the poverty, when she had known love and happiness and hope. There was a garden, Margaret would say, her voice soft with memory. A beautiful garden with roses of every color, and a man who loved me. We were going to have a life together, a family. But the world had other plans. Emma had always assumed these were fairy tales, stories invented to make their difficult reality more bearable. Now she wondered if they had been memories, pieces of a past that Margaret had hidden for 4 decades. The sandwich finished, Emma stood and walked around the empty hall. Her footsteps echoed against the marble, lonely sounds in a space designed to impress and intimidate. She stopped before a wall covered in portraits, former directors and presidents of the bank, their faces frozen in expressions of prosperity and self-satisfaction. Near the end of the row, she found what she was looking for, without knowing she had been searching for it. Robert Ashford, director, 1975-2005. The portrait showed a man in his middle years, with distinguished gray at his temples and eyes that seemed, to Emma at least, to hold some secret sadness beneath their professional composure. He looked nothing like Victor, or perhaps everything like him, just with the cruelty filtered out. "My grandmother knew you," Emma whispered to the portrait. "What happened between you? What secret was worth keeping for 40 years? The portrait offered no answers, but Emma felt, for just a moment, that something in those painted eyes was trying to speak to her. An hour later, the bank's rear entrance opened, and an elderly man entered, leaning heavily on a cane. Samuel Whitfield was 81 years old, stooped with age but still sharp-eyed, still carrying himself with the gravity of someone who knew where all the bodies were buried. He stopped when he saw Emma standing in the center of the grand hall. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. "Good Lord," he finally breathed. "You look exactly like her. Exactly like Margaret when she was young." Emma took a step forward. "You knew my grandmother?" "Knew her?" Samuel's laugh was bitter and sad. "Child, I was there for all of it. The love, the betrayal, the tragedy. I was Robert Ashford's closest friend and his personal attorney. I watched him fall in love with Margaret Sullivan. I watched his family destroy that love, and I watched him spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for a sin he could never truly repair." Victor had emerged from his office and stood at the top of the marble stairs, hearing every word. "Samuel, what the hell are you talking about? What sin? What does this girl have to do with my father?" Samuel looked up at Victor, then back at Emma. The weight of decades pressed down upon his frail shoulders. "I think we all need to sit down," he said. "This is a long story, and none of you are going to like how it ends, or rather, how it begins." They gathered in a private meeting room. Victor, Helena, Emma, and Samuel. The old lawyer set a worn leather briefcase on the table and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were documents yellowed with age, photographs with curled edges, and letters tied with faded ribbon. 43 years ago, Samuel began, Robert Ashford was not yet the man you remember, Victor. He was young, idealistic, and very much in love. He had met Margaret Sullivan at a charity event where she was working as a server. Their connection was immediate and intense. He pulled out a photograph and placed it on the table. It showed a young couple standing in a garden full of roses. The man was clearly Robert Ashford, decades younger, his face bright with unguarded joy. The woman beside him was beautiful, with autumn-colored eyes that Emma recognized instantly. "Grandmother," she whispered. "They wanted to marry," Samuel continued. "But Robert's family, particularly his mother Eleanor, would not permit it. Margaret was poor, uneducated, unsuitable. When Eleanor discovered the depth of their relationship, she gave Robert an ultimatum: end the affair, or be cut off from the family fortune completely." "My father wasn't a man to be bullied," Victor interjected. "No, he wasn't. And he refused. He told Margaret they would marry regardless of what his family thought. He opened this account for her as proof of his commitment, a gesture showing that he would share everything he had with her. Samuel paused, his old hands shuffling through the documents. But Eleanor Ashford was not a woman to be defied. When persuasion failed, she turned to crueler methods. She had Margaret kidnapped, held for 3 days, in an undisclosed location. She told Robert that if he didn't end the relationship immediately, Margaret would never be seen again. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Kidnapped? My grandmother was kidnapped? Robert capitulated. He had no choice. He agreed to end everything with Margaret to ensure her safety. But he also did something in secret, something even his mother never discovered. He arranged for the account to remain in Margaret's name, with instructions for the investments to continue growing. He hoped that one day, when his mother was gone, he could find Margaret again and make things right. But he never did, Victor said slowly, pieces clicking into place. He married my mother instead. He had me. He became the man I remember. Your father never stopped loving Margaret, Samuel said gently, but he also never found the courage to defy his family again. By the time Eleanor died, decades had passed. Robert didn't know where Margaret was, didn't know if she was alive or dead. He hired investigators, but she had disappeared completely, changed her name, moved constantly, lived off the grid. She was hiding, Emma said softly. She was always afraid. She never told me of what, but she was always looking over her shoulder, always ready to run. She had reason to fear. Eleanor Ashford's reach was long, and Margaret never trusted that the family had truly let her go. Samuel pulled out one final document from his briefcase. It was a letter in Robert Ashford's handwriting, dated just days before his death. Robert wrote this 20 years ago when he knew his time was short. He gave it to me with specific instructions. If anyone ever came looking for the account, if Margaret or her heirs ever appeared, I was to give them this. He slid the letter across the table to Emma. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Read it aloud, Victor said, his voice strange and tight. Emma cleared her throat and began to read. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then somehow, against all odds, you have found your way back to me, or at least to what I left behind for you. I have so many regrets, but the greatest is that I was not brave enough to fight for our love when it mattered most. I never married for love. I never knew happiness after you. Every day of my life I wondered where you were, if you were safe, if you ever thought of me. This money is not an apology. Nothing could ever apologize for what my family did to you. It is simply everything I had to give, offered in the hope that it might provide you some measure of comfort and security. If you have a family now, please know that I wish them nothing but joy. And if you have children or grandchildren, please tell them this. True love exists. I know because I felt it once. For a girl with autumn eyes in a garden full of roses. Forever yours, Robert. Emma finished reading. Tears streamed down her face freely now, and she made no effort to stop them. Victor sat in stunned silence, his entire understanding of his father reconstructing itself around this new information. The distant, cold man he remembered had apparently been nursing a broken heart for his entire life. Every dinner where his father seemed elsewhere, every moment of emotional absence, it all made terrible sense now. There's one more thing, Samuel said quietly. Something even this letter doesn't address directly. He looked at Emma with ancient, knowing eyes. Margaret was pregnant when Eleanor had her kidnapped. She was carrying Robert's child, a daughter. The room went absolutely still. That daughter, Samuel continued, was your mother, Emma, Clara Sullivan, which means Robert Ashford was your grandfather. And Victor, he turned to the stunned banker. This girl is your niece. She's family. She's blood. Emma and Victor stared at each other across the table, the enormous weight of this revelation settling over them like a shroud. The girl in torn clothes, the arrogant banker, family, and the fortune between them was just the beginning of the secrets yet to be revealed. The meeting room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had contracted around the weight of what had just been revealed. Victor Ashford sat motionless, his hands flat on the table, staring at Emma with an expression that shifted between disbelief, horror, and something that might have been the first stirrings of shame. His niece, the homeless girl he had mocked in front of dozens of wealthy clients, the child whose poverty he had used as entertainment. She was his blood. "This is impossible," Victor finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. "My father would have told me. He would have—" "Your father spent 20 years trying to find Margaret," Samuel interrupted gently. "He hired private investigators. He searched public records. He never stopped looking. But Margaret had become a ghost. She changed her name multiple times, never stayed in one place longer than a few months, never left a trail that could be followed. Because she was terrified," Emma said quietly. "She was always afraid. Even when I was little, she would check the locks 3 times before bed. She would watch the streets before we left any building. I thought she was just nervous by nature. Now I understand." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. He walked to the window, his back to the others, unable to face Emma while he processed this information. "If Margaret was pregnant when my grandmother had her kidnapped, then my father knew. He knew he had a child out there somewhere. He suspected," Samuel confirmed. "Margaret never had the chance to tell him directly before she was taken. But he did the math. He spent decades wondering if he had a son or daughter living somewhere in the world, growing up without knowing their father." "And my mother?" Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Clara? What happened to her?" Samuel's expression grew even more sorrowful. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew another photograph, this one showing a young woman with the same autumn eyes as Emma and Margaret, but with darker hair and a smile that seemed to carry hidden sadness. Clara Sullivan was born 8 months after Margaret was released. Margaret raised her alone, moving from city to city, always staying one step ahead of anyone who might be looking. She worked whatever job she could find, cleaning, sewing, factory work. She never touched the account Robert had created because she was afraid it would lead the Ashford family directly to her. "She lived in poverty to protect herself," Emma whispered, "to protect my mother. And eventually to protect you." Victor turned from the window. "What happened to Clara? Why isn't she here instead of her daughter?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Samuel looked at Emma with questioning eyes, silently asking permission to tell this part of the story. Emma nodded slowly. "My mother died when I was 4 years old," Emma said, her voice steady despite the pain visible in her eyes. "I barely remember her, just fragments. Her voice singing to me at night, the way she smelled like lavender, the feeling of her arms around me." "How did she die?" Victor asked, and for the first time there was no cruelty in his voice, only a genuine, almost desperate need to understand. "A car accident," Emma replied. "At least that's what my grandmother told me. But now I wonder if that was the whole truth." Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There were questions about the accident. The police report stated that Clara's brakes failed on a mountain road. Her car went over a cliff. But the mechanic who examined the wreckage privately told Margaret that the brake lines appeared to have been cut." The room fell into shocked silence. Helena, who had been quietly observing from the corner, let out a small gasp. "Are you saying she was murdered?" Victor's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm saying that Margaret believed so. She believed that Eleanor Ashford, even in her old age, had finally tracked them down. Whether or not that's true, we'll likely never know. Eleanor died just 2 years after Clara, taking whatever secrets she had to her grave." Victor felt sick. His grandmother, the stern, imperious woman who had raised him after his mother's early death, who had shaped his values and his worldview, might have been responsible for murder, not just the figurative murder of his father's happiness, but the literal murder of an innocent woman. "This can't be real," Victor said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. Everything made terrible sense now. His father's distance, his sadness, the way he would sometimes stare at old photographs with tears in his eyes, the way Eleanor had always insisted that family legacy was more important than personal happiness, the way she had raised Victor to value wealth and status above all else. He had been shaped by a monster, and he had become one himself. "After my mother died," Emma continued, "my grandmother took me and ran. We went further underground than ever before. She was convinced that whoever had killed Clara would come for us next. So we lived in shelters, in church basements, in abandoned buildings. We never stayed anywhere long. We never trusted anyone. But you're here now," Helena said softly, speaking for the first time in what felt like hours. "You came to the bank. Weren't you afraid?" Emma looked at her with those remarkable autumn eyes. My grandmother said that when she died, the danger would die with her. She was the one they wanted, the woman who had stolen Robert Ashford's heart, the living reminder of the family's greatest scandal. With her gone, I was just an orphan. Nobody special. Nobody worth hunting. You're not nobody, Victor said suddenly, surprising everyone, including himself. You're my niece, my father's granddaughter. The words seemed to cost him something. His whole life, Victor had built walls around himself, fortresses of arrogance and contempt that kept the world at a safe distance. Now those walls were crumbling, and he didn't know who he was without them. Samuel cleared his throat. There's more you need to know about the account itself and what Robert intended. He pulled out another document, this one more recent, dated just 5 years ago. Before he died, Robert added a codicil to the account. He specified that if the account was ever claimed by Margaret or her descendants, certain conditions would apply. Conditions? Victor frowned. What kind of conditions? The funds are to be released in full to the legitimate heir. But there's a provision that gives the current director of Grand Metropolitan Bank, which is you, Victor, the responsibility of ensuring the heir's welfare and education until they reach the age of 21. Victor stared at the document. My father wanted me to be responsible for his grandchild. He didn't even know I existed when he wrote this. He updated it 15 years ago when you became director. He knew exactly who would be reading these words if the account was ever claimed. He was counting on you, Victor. Counting on the son he raised to do right by the family he'd lost. The weight of that expectation pressed down on Victor like a physical force. His father had trusted him, had believed that despite everything, despite the influence of Eleanor, despite the cruelty that had become second nature, Victor would step up when it mattered. And how had Victor repaid that trust? By laughing at a homeless child, by mocking her in front of a crowd, by treating her with the same contempt that Eleanor had taught him to feel for anyone below his station. I need air, Victor said abruptly, pushing back from the table. I need to think. He strode out of the meeting room, his footsteps echoing in the empty banking hall. The portraits of former directors watched him pass, including his father's gentle, sad eyes following him all the way to the door. Outside, the afternoon sun was harsh and unforgiving. Victor stood on the steps of the bank he had ruled like a kingdom, feeling more lost than he had ever felt in his life. Everything he believed about himself, about his family, about the world, it was all built on lies. His grandmother had been a kidnapper, possibly a murderer. His father had spent his life mourning a love he'd been forced to abandon. And Victor himself had become exactly what Eleanor had designed him to be. A man without compassion, without humanity, without love. He thought about Emma, about the dignity she had maintained even while being humiliated, about the quiet strength in her voice when she spoke about her grandmother's death, about those autumn eyes that held no hatred, no desire for revenge, only a desperate need for truth. She was better than him. This homeless child with nothing to her name was infinitely better than Victor Ashford with all his millions. The realization broke something inside him. When Victor returned to the meeting room half an hour later, his face was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. Samuel, what do I need to do to fulfill my father's wishes? The old lawyer looked at him with something like hope. First, we need to legally verify Emma's identity. DNA testing, documentation, the standard procedures. Once that's complete, the funds become hers, with you as trustee until she reaches 21. And in the meantime, where will she live? Emma looked up, surprised by the question. She had assumed she would return to the streets once the business was concluded, perhaps with enough money to rent a room somewhere. She hadn't allowed herself to hope for more. I don't need anything from you, she said quickly. Just the truth. That's what I came for. But the truth comes with responsibility, Victor replied. My father's wishes are clear. You need a guardian. You need someone to ensure your welfare and education. He paused, the next words seeming to stick in his throat. You need family. Helena stepped forward. Mr. Ashford, are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that I've spent 53 years being the man my grandmother created. I think it's time I became the man my father hoped I could be. Victor looked directly at Emma. I have a large house. Too large for one person. Empty rooms that have never been used. It's not much, but it's better than the streets. Emma stared at him in disbelief. Why would you do that? An hour ago, you were laughing at me. You wanted to throw me out like garbage. An hour ago, I was a different person. Or rather, I was exactly the person I've always been. And I'm ashamed of it. Victor's voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion he had shown all day. I can't change what I did. I can't take back the words or the laughter. But I can choose what happens next. I can choose to be better. How do I know this isn't another trick? Another way to humiliate me? You don't, Victor admitted. You have no reason to trust me. I haven't earned it. But I'm asking for the chance to try. Not for my sake. For my father's. For the grandfather you never knew, who spent his whole life regretting that he couldn't be there for you. Emma looked at Samuel, then at Helena, searching their faces for guidance. Samuel nodded slowly. Robert would have wanted this, the old lawyer said. More than anything, he would have wanted his granddaughter to be safe, to be cared for, to have the life that was stolen from her mother and grandmother. Emma closed her eyes. She thought about Margaret, about all those years of running and hiding, about the final weeks when her grandmother had known death was coming, and had still found the strength to prepare Emma for this moment. My grandmother told me something before she died, Emma said quietly. She said that holding onto anger was like carrying poison and expecting the other person to die. She said that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what people did. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of their sins. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Victor. I don't forgive you for how you treated me today. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'm willing to give you the chance to earn it. That's more than your grandmother ever gave mine. Victor felt tears prick at his eyes, tears that hadn't fallen since he was a young boy, before Eleanor had taught him that crying was weakness. Thank you, he said simply. I won't waste this chance. Samuel began gathering the documents, his old hands moving with renewed purpose. There's much to be done. Legal procedures, DNA verification, transfer of guardianship. It will take time. Then we'd better start now, Victor said. Helena, cancel all my appointments for the rest of the week. This takes priority over everything. Helena nodded, but there was something in her expression, a flicker of calculation that went unnoticed in the emotional weight of the moment. She excused herself to make the necessary calls, her heels clicking against the marble as she walked away. In the meeting room, Victor and Emma sat in awkward silence, two strangers bound by blood and tragedy, trying to imagine a future neither of them had expected. I should tell you, Victor said eventually, that this won't be easy. I'm not a kind man. I don't know how to be a guardian or a parent. I've spent my whole life being exactly the opposite of those things. My grandmother wasn't perfect either, Emma replied. She had secrets. She made choices that kept us poor and struggling when we didn't have to be. But she loved me. That was enough. I don't know if I can love, Victor admitted. I'm not sure I know what that word means anymore. Emma considered this for a moment. My grandmother used to say that love isn't a feeling, it's a choice. You choose to care about someone. You choose to put their needs before your wants. You choose to show up, day after day, even when it's hard. She paused. Maybe you don't need to feel love right now. Maybe you just need to choose it. Victor looked at this remarkable child, this girl who had survived poverty, loss, and humiliation with her spirit intact, and wondered how she had become so wise while he had become so small. I'll try, he said. I'll try to choose it. Outside the meeting room, Helena stood in a quiet corridor, her phone pressed to her ear. Yes, I'm certain, she whispered. The girl is the heir to the Sullivan account. Nearly $1 billion, and Victor is going to become her guardian. She listened for a moment, then smiled coldly. Of course there's an opportunity here. There's always an opportunity. Just tell Mr. Blackwell that I'll be in touch with details. She ended the call and composed her face back into its professional mask before returning to the meeting room, where Victor and Emma were taking the first fragile steps toward becoming a family. Neither of them noticed the predator in their midst, and neither of them knew that the greatest danger was not in the past, but waiting patiently in the days ahead. The Ashford mansion stood like a monument to excess at the end of a long gated driveway. Its stone facade stretched across manicured grounds, with windows that gleamed like hollow eyes, watching Emma's approach. She had never seen a house so large, so imposing, so utterly devoid of warmth. "This is where you live?" Emma asked as Victor's car pulled to a stop before the grand entrance. "This is where I exist," Victor replied, and there was a bitterness in his voice that surprised her. "I wouldn't call it living, not really." A housekeeper named Beatrice met them at the door, her face registering barely concealed shock at Emma's appearance. Victor had arranged for new clothes to be purchased, but Emma had insisted on wearing her old ones for now. They were all she had left of her life with Margaret. "Miss Emma will be staying in the East Wing," Victor instructed. "Prepare the blue suite, and Beatrice, she is to be treated as family, because that's what she is." Beatrice nodded, her eyes flickering between Victor and Emma with undisguised curiosity. In all her years of service, she had never heard Victor Ashford use the word family with anything resembling affection. The first days in the mansion were disorienting for Emma. She wandered through endless corridors filled with priceless art that no one ever looked at, past rooms furnished with antiques that no one ever used. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant footsteps of staff who moved like ghosts through the empty spaces. Victor, true to his word, tried to be present. He ate breakfast with Emma each morning, asking awkward questions about her interests and education. He arranged for tutors to assess her academic level, and was genuinely impressed to discover that despite years of interrupted schooling, she read at a level far beyond her age. "My grandmother taught me," Emma explained when he commented on her vocabulary. "She believed that books were the one thing no one could take away from us. We spent hours in public libraries. It was the only place we ever felt truly safe. But beneath the surface of this fragile new arrangement, danger was gathering." Helena Monroe had worked at Grand Metropolitan Bank for 12 years, climbing the ladder through a combination of competence and ruthlessness. She had long ago identified Victor Ashford as a means to an end, a powerful man whose weaknesses she catalogued and filed away for future use. She had expected to eventually leverage those weaknesses for her own advancement, perhaps even to take his position. But the arrival of Emma Sullivan had changed everything. Nearly $1 billion suddenly in play, a child as the heir, and Victor Ashford, of all people, experiencing something that looked suspiciously like a moral awakening. Helena recognized the opportunity immediately, and she knew exactly who would pay handsomely for the information. Marcus Blackwell was a man who operated in the shadows between legitimate business and outright criminality. He specialized in what he called asset recovery, a polite term for manipulating vulnerable heirs out of their inheritances through a combination of legal tricks, psychological manipulation, and, when necessary, more direct methods. They met in a private room at a restaurant far from the financial district, where no one from the bank would see them together. "Tell me everything," Blackwell said, his cold eyes fixed on Helena across the table. Helena laid out the situation with clinical precision. The account, the heir, the DNA testing that would confirm Emma's identity within days, and most importantly, Victor's apparent transformation from ruthless banker to aspiring guardian. "He's vulnerable right now," Helena concluded. "Confused, guilty. He's making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. That creates openings." Blackwell nodded slowly, his mind already calculating angles and approaches. "The girl is the key. If she's removed from the picture before the legal guardianship is finalized, the account goes into limbo, and accounts in limbo can be redirected." "Removed?" Helena felt a flicker of unease. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Nothing violent, if that's what you're worried about. Violence is messy and attracts attention. No, there are cleaner ways. The girl lived on the streets for weeks after her grandmother died. She's traumatized, unstable. It wouldn't take much to convince a judge that she's not mentally competent to manage such a fortune. A few expert witnesses, some carefully documented incidents, and she could be declared a ward of the state instead of Victor Ashford. And then? And then we ensure that the state-appointed financial guardian is someone sympathetic to our interests. The girl ends up in foster care. The money ends up in accounts we control, and everyone wins." He smiled coldly. "Except the girl, of course. But people like her are used to losing." Helena felt the unease grow stronger, but she pushed it aside. She had made her choice when she picked up the phone. There was no going back now. "What do you need from me?" "Access, information, details about the girl's mental state, any incidents that might suggest instability. And I need you to slow down the DNA verification process. Give us time to put our pieces in place." Helena nodded. "I can do that. But I want my share in writing, 20% of whatever you recover from the account. Blackwell's smile widened. You'll have it. We're going to be very good partners, Ms. Monroe. While Helena plotted in the shadows, Emma was discovering something unexpected in the Ashford mansion. Evidence of her grandfather's love. She found it in the library, a vast room that Victor had told her was off-limits to no one. Among the leather-bound legal volumes and financial texts, there was a section of books that seemed out of place. Children's stories, fairy tales, volumes of poetry. Emma pulled one from the shelf and found an inscription on the first page. For the child, I may never know. May you find magic in words, as your grandmother did. R.A. The books were gifts, dozens of them, purchased over decades, inscribed with messages to a grandchild Robert Ashford had never stopped hoping to meet. He had filled a library with love letters to a ghost. Emma sat on the floor of the library and wept for the grandfather she had never known, for the father her mother had been denied, for all the years of connection that had been stolen by fear and cruelty. That was how Victor found her, curled among the books, tears streaming down her face, clutching a volume of fairy tales to her chest. I never understood why he kept buying children's books, Victor said softly, sitting down on the floor beside her. He had no grandchildren. At least, that's what I believed. I thought it was just another sign of his sadness, his distance from reality. He was hoping, Emma whispered. All those years he was hoping I would come. Victor looked at the books surrounding them, seeing them for the first time with new eyes. His father had never been distant or cold. He had been heartbroken. Every children's book was a prayer, a wish, a refusal to give up hope. I wasted so much time, Victor said, his voice cracking. I could have asked him about his sadness. I could have tried to understand. Instead, I just accepted my grandmother's version of who he was. Weak, sentimental, too soft for the business world. I never looked deeper. You were a child, Emma said. Children believe what they're told. I haven't been a child for a long time. I had decades to question, to dig, to find the truth. I didn't because it was easier not to. Because Eleanor's version of the world made me feel superior, powerful, justified in my cruelty. Victor's hands trembled as he picked up one of the books. I became exactly what she wanted me to become, and I never even realized I had a choice. They sat together in silence, two broken people surrounded by the artifacts of a love that had refused to die. Meanwhile, across the city, another piece of Emma's past was preparing to resurface. Dorothy Chen had volunteered at the Riverside shelter for 15 years. She had seen thousands of faces come and go, the desperate, the broken, the lost. Most blurred together after a while, a stream of humanity seeking temporary refuge from the harshness of the streets. But she had never forgotten Margaret and Emma Sullivan. There was something different about them. The grandmother had an air of faded elegance, a way of speaking that suggested education and culture despite their circumstances. And the child, Emma, had eyes that seemed to see right through you, wise beyond her years, carrying knowledge that no child should have to bear. Dorothy had tried to help them. She had offered to connect Margaret with social services, with medical care, with programs that might provide more permanent housing. But Margaret had always refused, her eyes flickering with that familiar fear. We can't be in any systems, Margaret had whispered once. We can't leave traces. They might still be looking. Dorothy had never understood who they were, but she had respected Margaret's wishes. She had done what she could within those limits. Extra blankets when nights were cold, books for Emma from her own collection, a listening ear when Margaret needed to talk. When Margaret died, Dorothy had been devastated. She had tried to find Emma, but the girl had vanished from the shelter before anyone could intervene. Dorothy had assumed the worst. Another child lost to the streets, another tragedy in a city full of them. Then she saw the news. The story had leaked, despite Victor's attempts to control it. A homeless girl found to be the heir to a massive fortune. A dramatic confrontation at Grand Metropolitan Bank. A billionaire banker revealed to be her uncle. The photos accompanying the story showed Emma's face clearly. Dorothy recognized her instantly. She also recognized something else, the danger that publicity brought. If there were truly people who had hunted Margaret for decades, they would see these stories too. They would know that Emma had surfaced. Dorothy picked up her phone and dialed the main number for Grand Metropolitan Bank. She needed to warn someone. She needed to make sure Emma was protected. But when she asked to speak with Victor Ashford about Emma Sullivan, the voice that answered was cool and professional. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Ashford isn't taking calls about that matter. If you'd like to leave a message, I can pass it along." The voice belonged to Helena Monroe. Dorothy left her name and number, expressing urgency. Helena wrote down the information with a cold smile, then immediately called Blackwell. "Someone from the shelter where the grandmother died is trying to reach Victor. Name is Dorothy Chen. She sounds worried about the girl." "Interesting," Blackwell murmured. "She might know things about the girl's history that could be useful. Or she might be a problem. Either way, I'll look into it." That night, Emma woke from a nightmare she couldn't remember. Only the feeling of being chased through endless dark corridors. She lay in the unfamiliar luxury of her new bed, heart pounding, listening to the silence of the mansion. Something felt wrong. She slipped out of bed and padded to the window. The grounds were dark and still, but as she watched, she saw something, a flicker of movement near the gate. A car parked on the street, its lights off, a shadow behind the wheel. It could be nothing. A neighbor, someone lost, or it could be them. The fear that had been her grandmother's constant companion for 4 decades suddenly felt very real, very present, very close. Emma backed away from the window, her mind racing. She had thought that coming forward, claiming her inheritance, becoming visible would end the hiding. She had believed her grandmother's words, that with Margaret gone, the danger would die too. But what if Margaret had been wrong? What if the past wasn't finished with her yet? She thought about waking Victor but stopped herself. She had no proof of anything, just a feeling, an instinct honed by years of running. He would think she was being paranoid. Maybe she was. But Emma had learned long ago to trust her instincts. They had kept her alive on the streets. They had guided her to the bank, when every rational thought told her she would only be humiliated. She found a piece of paper in the desk drawer and began to write, documenting everything she knew, everything her grandmother had told her, every detail about the Ashford family history that had been revealed in the past days. If something happened to her, someone needed to know the truth. She hid the paper behind one of her grandfather's books in the library, choosing a volume of fairy tales inscribed with particular tenderness. "For my little one, wherever you are, may you always find your way home." Then she returned to bed and lay awake until dawn, watching the shadows move across the ceiling, waiting for the wolves she knew were circling. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. Victor was in his study when Beatrice announced that a woman named Dorothy Chen was at the door, insisting she had information about Emma that couldn't wait. Helena, who happened to be at the mansion delivering documents for Victor's signature, felt her blood run cold. "I can speak with her," Helena offered quickly. "You're busy, and I can determine if it's worth your time." But Emma had already appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the sound of a familiar name. "Dorothy?" she called out, descending rapidly. Dorothy from Riverside. The woman who entered the foyer had gray-streaked hair and kind eyes that filled with tears when she saw Emma. "Oh, thank God," Dorothy breathed. "Thank God you're alive. When you disappeared from the shelter, I thought, I was so afraid." Emma flew into her arms, and for a moment, the two embraced like long-lost family. Victor watched the reunion with a mixture of relief and unease. This woman clearly cared about Emma, but she also represented a past that he was only beginning to understand, and she might have information that could complicate the careful narrative they were constructing. Helena watched with barely concealed alarm. Dorothy Chen was a wild card, an unknown quantity who could derail everything. "We need to talk," Dorothy said urgently, pulling back from the embrace but keeping her hands on Emma's shoulders. "All of us. There are things you need to know, things Margaret told me before she died." She looked directly at Victor, then at Helena, her expression sharpening. "And there are things I need to tell you about who might be watching. Because I've seen this before, when someone surfaces after years of hiding. The people who were hunting them don't just give up. They wait. They watch." Her eyes moved to the window as if scanning for threats. "And then they strike." Dorothy Chen stood in the center of Victor Ashford's library, surrounded by the books that Robert had collected for a grandchild he never met. Her eyes moved across the shelves with a recognition that made Emma's heart beat faster. She told me about these, Dorothy said softly. Margaret. In her final days, when she knew she was dying, she talked about Robert and the books. She said he used to read to her in a garden full of roses. She said he promised that one day he would read to their children and grandchildren in that same garden. Victor stepped forward, his voice tight. How much did Margaret tell you? Everything. Dorothy turned to face them all, Victor, Emma, and Helena, who stood near the door with a carefully composed expression. Margaret knew she was dying for months before the end. She had time to prepare, and part of that preparation was making sure someone besides Emma knew the truth. She reached into her bag and withdrew a thick envelope, worn at the edges but sealed with red wax. She gave me this the week before she died. She made me promise not to open it unless Emma was in danger. She said I would know when the time was right. Helena's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. That's very touching, but I'm not sure what danger you're imagining. Emma is perfectly safe here with her uncle. Dorothy's eyes fixed on Helena with an intensity that made the younger woman take an involuntary step backward. Margaret also told me something else. She said that when Emma finally claimed her inheritance, there would be wolves, people who would try to take what was rightfully hers. She said to watch for the ones who smiled the most and questioned the least. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Helena laughed, but the sound was brittle. I really don't know what you're implying, but I have work to do at the bank. Victor, I'll leave these documents for your review. She turned toward the door, but Emma's voice stopped her. Why did you intercept Dorothy's call? Helena froze. What? Dorothy called the bank days ago, asking to speak with Victor about me. She left her name and number, but Victor never received the message. Emma's autumn eyes were steady, unflinching. I asked Beatrice to check the phone logs this morning. Your extension was the last one to receive a transferred call from outside before Dorothy showed up in person. The color drained from Helena's face. Victor stepped between her and the door, his expression hardening into something that reminded everyone in the room that he had once been the most ruthless banker in the city. Helena, I think you need to explain yourself, now. For a long moment, Helena said nothing. Then her composure shattered completely, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. You have no idea what you're throwing away, she spat at Victor. 40 years of service my family gave to this bank. My mother worked here. My grandmother worked here. And for what? So that a street urchin can waltz in and claim $1 billion because she has the right eyes? Your family's service to the bank has nothing to do with Emma's inheritance, Victor replied. What have you done, Helena? What needed to be done? What you were too weak and sentimental to do yourself? Helena's voice rose. That money should have been discovered years ago. It should have been absorbed into the bank's general funds when no heir came forward. Instead, your father hid it, protected it, kept it sacred for his precious lost love. She laughed bitterly. And now you're going to give it all to a child who can't even manage to brush her hair properly. A child who will squander centuries of accumulated wealth on whatever idealistic nonsense fills her head? The money was never yours to decide about, Emma said quietly. It was never the bank's. It was my grandmother's. It was my mother's. And now it's mine. Not if Marcus Blackwell has anything to say about it. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Victor's face went pale. Blackwell? The asset recovery specialist? Helena, please tell me you didn't. I did exactly what needed to be done. Blackwell has resources, connections, expertise. By next week, there will be serious questions about this child's mental fitness to manage such a fortune. Expert witnesses will testify about the trauma of homelessness, the instability of her upbringing. A judge will declare her incompetent, and the money will be placed in professional management. You mean stolen? Dorothy interjected. Call it what it is. I call it justice. I call it proper order. People like her don't deserve. Enough! Victor's voice cut through Helena's tirade like a blade. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Security? This is Victor Ashford. I need you to detain Helena Monroe immediately. She is not to leave the premises or access any bank systems. Contact the police and tell them we have evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. Helena's eyes went wide. You can't do this. I know things about this bank, about you, about my past cruelty, my arrogance, my treatment of employees. Victor's smile was cold. Please share it all. I've spent 53 years building a reputation I'm now ashamed of. Watching it burn down might be the most honest thing I've ever done. Security arrived within minutes. As Helena was escorted out, still shouting threats and accusations, Emma felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. She was the one watching the house, Emma said softly, or someone working with her. Blackwell's people, most likely, Victor confirmed grimly. I know his methods. Surveillance, intimidation, building a case file of supposed instability. He's good at what he does. But now we know, Dorothy said. Now we can prepare. Victor shook his head. No. Now we end it. The confrontation with Marcus Blackwell happened 3 days later, in a conference room at Grand Metropolitan Bank. Victor had arranged everything carefully. Lawyers, security, recording equipment, and most importantly, the documents that Dorothy had brought from Margaret. Blackwell arrived expecting a negotiation. He left in handcuffs. The envelope Margaret had given Dorothy contained more than memories. It contained evidence, decades of carefully documented records that Margaret had kept, detailing Eleanor Ashford's original crimes, bank statements, photographs, witness testimonies from people who had helped kidnap her, recorded secretly over the years, as Margaret tracked them down one by one, never confronting them, simply gathering proof. Your grandmother was remarkable, Samuel Whitfield said as they reviewed the documents afterward. She spent 40 years building a case that could never be prosecuted because Eleanor was already dead. But she kept every piece of evidence, knowing that someday it might be needed to protect you. She was protecting me even after death, Emma whispered. The documents also contained something else. Letters from Robert Ashford, smuggled to Margaret through intermediaries over the years. Letters expressing his love, his regret, his desperate hope that she and their child were safe. Letters that proved definitively that he had never stopped loving her, never stopped trying to find her, never stopped believing they would be reunited. The last letter was dated just days before Robert's death. My dearest Margaret, Emma read aloud, her voice trembling. I am dying. The doctors say I have weeks, perhaps less. I have spent my entire life in a prison of my own making, too afraid to break the chains my mother wrapped around me. I never found you. I never met our child. I never held my grandchildren in my arms. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. If there is any justice in the universe, you will find what I left for you. And you will know that in the end, love was the only thing that mattered. Forever yours, Robert. Victor wept openly as Emma finished reading. It was the first time in decades that he had allowed himself to cry. And once started, he couldn't stop. He wept for his father's broken heart. He wept for the grandmother who had twisted him into something cruel. He wept for all the years he had wasted being exactly what Eleanor had designed him to be. And he wept for Emma, for the childhood she had lost, for the family she had never known, for the grandmother who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice raw. I'm so sorry for all of it, for how I treated you that first day, for the person I've been, for everything my family did to yours. Emma crossed the room and did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She hugged him. My grandmother said that forgiveness isn't about excusing what people did. It's about choosing not to carry the weight of their sins. She pulled back and looked at him with those autumn eyes, Robert's eyes, Margaret's eyes. I forgive you, Uncle Victor. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to spend my life being angry. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later, confirming what everyone already knew. Emma Sullivan was the biological granddaughter of Robert Ashford, entitled to the full inheritance of the account he had created. But Emma had already made her decision about what to do with the money. I want to create a foundation, she announced at a gathering that included Victor, Samuel, Dorothy, and Beatrice. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Invisible People. Invisible people? Victor asked. That's what my grandmother called them. The homeless, the refugees, the workers who clean offices and serve food and raise other people's children. The people that society looks right through, never seeing their humanity. My grandmother was invisible for 40 years. She lived among invisible people. She died among them. Emma's voice grew stronger. I want to change that. I want to create shelters that treat people with dignity. I want to fund education programs for people who never had the chance to finish school. I want to give the invisible a voice. Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes. Your grandmother would be so proud. I know, Emma smiled. She told me once that the measure of a person isn't how they treat the powerful. It's how they treat the powerless. I want to live up to that. Victor nodded slowly. You'll need help managing something this large. Lawyers, accountants, administrators. I was hoping you might help with that, Emma said, if you're willing. After everything I did, after how I treated you, because of what you're doing now, because you're choosing to be different. Emma took his hand. My grandmother believed in second chances. She gave one to every person she met at the shelter. She would want me to give one to you. Victor squeezed her hand, fresh tears forming in his eyes. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation launched 6 months later. Its first project was the renovation of the Riverside shelter, where Margaret had spent her final years. Dorothy was hired as the director, given full authority to transform it into a model of what homeless services could be. But the foundation's most impactful initiative was something Emma called the Invisible Voices program. It provided training and resources for homeless and marginalized individuals to share their stories, advocating for policy changes through the power of lived experience. Within a year, former shelter residents were testifying before city councils and state legislatures, their voices finally heard by those in power. Emma herself became an advocate, speaking at conferences and schools about her grandmother's legacy. She never hid her past. She wore it proudly, showing the world that poverty was not a moral failing, that circumstance did not determine worth, that every person had inherent dignity, regardless of their bank balance. Victor Ashford, meanwhile, underwent his own transformation. He stepped down as director of Grand Metropolitan Bank, citing a need to redirect his priorities. He devoted himself to the foundation's work, using his business expertise to ensure that every dollar was spent effectively. He also began quietly reaching out to former employees he had mistreated over the years, offering genuine apologies and, where appropriate, financial restitution. I can't undo the past, he told Emma one evening, as they walked through the garden at the Ashford mansion, a garden that now bloomed with roses of every color, planted in Margaret's memory. But I can try to make the future different. That's all any of us can do, Emma replied. Years passed. Emma grew into a remarkable young woman, her grandmother's wisdom guiding her every step. She never forgot where she came from, never lost the humility that had been forged in years of hardship. She kept the worn clothes she had worn that first day at the bank, displayed in a glass case in her office, as a reminder of how far she had come and how much work remained to be done. The paper she had hidden behind her grandfather's book was eventually framed and hung in the foundation's headquarters, a testament to a frightened girl who had dared to document the truth even when she thought no one would believe her. And in the library of the Ashford mansion, the children's books that Robert had collected remained on their shelves, their inscriptions read aloud now by Emma to groups of children from the shelters her foundation supported. The words her grandfather had written for her became gifts she shared with every child who needed to hear them. For the child I may never know. May you find magic in words, as your grandmother did. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, Emma made her annual pilgrimage to the small cemetery where her grandmother was buried beside her mother Clara. She laid roses on both graves and sat in the grass, speaking softly about the year that had passed, the lives that had been changed, the work that continued. I understand now, Grandma, she said. I understand why you never touched the money. It wasn't about fear, it was about values. You knew that money can corrupt, that it can make people forget what really matters. You wanted me to learn who I was without it first. You wanted me to know that my worth had nothing to do with numbers in a bank account. A breeze rustled through the cemetery, carrying the scent of roses. I promise I'll never forget. I promise I'll use everything you gave me. Not just the money, but the wisdom, the love, the strength, to help others find their way, just like you helped me find mine. She stood and looked at the sky, where clouds drifted lazily across an endless expanse of blue. Thank you, Grandma, for everything, for protecting me, for teaching me, for loving me enough to prepare me for a world you knew would try to break me. Emma smiled through her tears. I'm not broken, and I never will be, because I have your love inside me, and that's worth more than any fortune in any bank. She walked away from the graves, her steps firm and sure, carrying with her the inheritance that truly mattered, not the $800 million, but the lessons of a woman who had shown her that dignity cannot be bought, that love cannot be stolen, and that the measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you give away. Behind her, the roses on Margaret's grave swayed gently in the wind, as if the grandmother who had sacrificed everything was nodding in approval, finally at peace, finally home. And Emma Sullivan, once homeless, once invisible, once dismissed as worthless by a man who would become her family, walked forward into a future, bright with purpose, carrying the light of those who had loved her into a world that desperately needed it. The girl who had only wanted to check her balance had found something infinitely more valuable than money. She had found her inheritance, and it was love.